Welcome back to another episode of Break the Silence, Build the Future. I'm your host, Fartumo Kusow. Today's episode, I'm joined by the author and therapist, Sally McQuillen, whose debut memoir, Reaching for Beautiful, is luminous and gut-honest reflection on loving and losing her 21-year-old son, Christopher. This is not just a story of grief. It's a story of joy, of forgiveness, and of mother's journey through the impossible, learning how to keep living even when the person she loved the most is no longer here. In this episode, we're titling In Reaching for Beautiful, conversation on love, loss, and letting go. Sally, thank you so much for joining me and for being here. I would love if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, I'm Sally McQuillen, the author of Reaching for Beautiful and a psychotherapist, and also the mother of 3 children. My firstborn, Christopher, is the main character in Reaching for Beautiful, and I talk about the first year and a half after he died and what that was like, but also about what it was like to raise him and what it continues to be like to love him.
Thank you so much, Sally. I would love to start this interview, this discussion, where the book begins with Christopher. Could you introduce him to us? Not just as your son, not just as your firstborn son, but as the bright, wild, complicated soul he was, like most humans are.
Yes, that's part of the challenge of writing, is to have attempted to capture my son's spirit. And he was and continues to be such a bright, life living, all in, anything goes, life of the party spirit, and so witty, so charming, so captivating. Someone that, needless to say, I had a huge crush on from the moment he arrived. But he was fast and furious and wild and free. And I spent most of my time just trying to keep up with him. I often describe him as a sparkly, green-eyed, slim, slightly bronzed young man, sort of looking a little bit like Brad Pitt in his younger years, with light literally radiating from his heart. He was very open-hearted. There was an innocence about him, a sensitivity, a way of being here that now helps me, now that he's no longer here, realize that this life here on earth as a spiritual being may have just been too much for him. He didn't take his life. He did pass in an accident, but there was a part of him where, wow, it was a lot for him to take in some of the pain of the world. But he was always bringing joy.
Thank you so much. In reading your book, I found that you're writing with so much clarity and compassion, not just for Christopher, but for yourself. And I think as a parent, at least in my experience losing my daughter, there are all these questions running in my mind when she was gone, of things that I could have said but didn't, things I shouldn't have said but did, right? So those are the conflict that there's no way to go back. So in processing this and creating this podcast and writing about all this, I am trying to work in allowing myself some grace, which has been a challenge. So I was in awe how you were able to write with this so much compassion, not just for Christopher, but for yourself as his mother, who has all these questions that are coming up after he was gone. Because I think as a mothers, from the time we conceive them, we are always thinking about how to protect them. So I want to ask you, what led you to start writing this book of all the other things you have done? Was there a moment, was there an event, was there an idea that told you, yes, I am going to write this book?
Yes, so much that you were saying that I feel so deeply in terms of what we need to survive as parents who are grieving the loss of a child. But I did begin writing. I was inspired to write by a friend, but found myself being drawn to my phone, which is interesting because I was essentially texting to Christopher, and that was where my writing this memoir began. It was a desperate yearning, sort of born of that, to connect to him and to share what I was feeling and grappling with, as I didn't know where he'd gone, and I wanted to be able to feel him and talk to him. And of course, I would have liked and continue to wish I could see him. And so this was, I sort of felt like I was free falling, and this was one of the ways that I could tether myself to being alive. And that's where my writing began. And over time, through drafts and through the help of my writing group and teachers and editors, it became this story where it was also integrating my story and what it was like to be his mother, as well as what it's like inside grief over the loss of a child.
That's very interesting. So in this memoir, you describe Christopher as someone drawn to risk, someone who lived big and sometimes even dangerously. And that is a reality that shaped your parenting and your worry, because I know I'd experienced the same thing in my daughter, where in all her adult life, as soon as I left the teenage years and she started college, my relationship with her was shaped and continues to be shaped by her relationship with that person, because we didn't have the time to be adults together and connect, not as a mother and daughter, but two adult women that can support each other. We didn't have that chance because he was like, why are you going back? Well, this is happening. You know it's going to happen again, on and on. So I can relate to that. And so my question to you is, what did it mean to love a child whose life felt so close to the edge? Because he had, like you said, this zest for life and this spirit that didn't really, there was no space for him in this world. That's what I felt with my daughter. She was a person that took everybody in as they were, so there was no really safe space for her. So if you could tell us that, what did it mean for you to love that child whose life felt so close
Yes,
to the edge?
I will tell you that, and I wanted to say, insofar, I've thought about that as well. The fact that Christopher passed at 21, that's another, just, there's so many layers to grieving, and that's another one of the layers that would have been a yet for us, was to be able to have a little bit more of that peer relationship that I'm beginning to experience. I've got it with my daughter, who's 29 and about to be married, and really beginning to experience more deeply with my youngest at age 25. But we weren't in that space. And so I just kind of wanted to acknowledge that part of the grieving, because as parents, we grieve the yets as well as what was. And I've been talking a lot about this with various people. I think that all of us parents, regardless as to whether our children are as reckless and wild, and it would be really rare for children to be quite as reckless and wild as mine one was. He was in 3 near-death accidents before he passed at 21. Um, Regardless, parents are in fear of those things that aren't preventable, because we do see our job as being to protect and keep safe and keep alive our children. And I was fearful. I was absolutely riddled with fear. And probably even before Christopher arrived, I had some gravitational pull into, I think I was an anxious little girl, a sad little girl. I grew up the daughter of an alcoholic father. And so I think that sort of set the stage for being sensitive to um, other people and their feelings, and the impact of their feelings on me.
Wow. So that is really interesting the way you explained that there. And just like you said, so many parents carry unspoken fear, especially when challenges, whether it's addiction, mental health challenges, or violence, relationships, whatever the case might be. It's um, it's really this unspoken fear that we talk about. For me, the biggest one was that when I knew this beginning of this violence, because my daughter didn't want to share it with anybody, even her siblings, so I kept this silence that made me feel like I can't really speak to the fear I felt. I can't really speak to the challenges I faced. So the question to you is, did you feel alone in that space, in this space where you have this fear, but it was really hard to express it to others, or to explain it, or to have them understand where you're coming from?
Very much so. I was on autopilot and didn't, as of yet, have enough clarity to separate from the fact that I was having various PTSD
Yeah.
responses to
Yes.
the raising of my son. And I also appreciated what you were saying, that I think parents who have any children who are struggling in any way, that's another feature of what brings about fear. So when I recognized that Christopher was different, he was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder, which I didn't really know much about at the time. Now we know so much more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when he was diagnosed with some learning issues, to see him struggle with his differences was painful for me, in the same way that I'd had some shame and felt different as a child of divorce or the child of an alcoholic. So those are other things that we want to be able to spare our children from, but in truth are part of why I believe we're here, is to be presented with different challenges so that we can evolve and grow. And I only, in the hardest of ways, have learned the importance of trying to let go of this fear and
Mm-hmm.
become more conscious of
Mm-hmm.
making the choice to let go of it, because I
Mm-hmm.
don't think it serves us or
Mm-hmm.
our relationships or our children if we're carrying it. But no wonder we do, especially when it taps into our own shame. And that was part of your question. You said, did you feel alone? I did. I felt alone. There were times I felt judged by other mothers who had better luck controlling their children, or whose children were compliant as opposed to defiant, or who weren't out over their skis from day one. So
Mm-hmm.
I envied them a little bit for that, and I understood how it appeared, but I was trying my best.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I felt that too, and it's even now when I go on social media and I post about my daughter and what has happened, I see the judgment coming. So that's really one thing that keeps a lot of people opening up. So I'm glad you're opening up and writing about it, because that's another challenge. So there is a moment for any parent who lost a child. There is a clear moment, defined moment, when everything changes. What you thought was the case is never the case, can never be the case, would never be the case. For example, in ideally we think we go before our children and they would be the one to bury us and do our final process. That's the intellectual process of how things should work. But when this happens, it doesn't only have you lose your child, but the part of you that felt this child would be after you, would be decades to come, however long you live, to be part of your life, and would outgrow all these challenges, and there would be different, better days ahead. So that part of yourself, that part that believed the way things work, dies with that child, unfortunately. So for me, it's like a clear distinction. The minute the police came to my house and they said that her husband was arrested for her murder, that's like a clear day that I cannot go back. And a part of me that hoped she would get out of this situation and be better for died with that one sentence. So when Christopher died, your greatest fear, I'm sure, became real, that you lost your child, and there's nothing more real than that. And you name that so honestly in the book. Can you share how that moment unfolded for you and how it made your world shift?
Yes, it's impossible to reflect back on that moment without appreciating what a traumatic experience it is, how world rocking to feel suddenly without a part of you. And my survival has required getting to a place where I can essentially reintegrate Christopher as a part of me, because the connection to our children is so profound, and my love and loyalty is so fierce that I didn't just lose him, I lost the world as I knew it. And I think that's what you're describing. There's a loss of innocence, and there was a loss of light. I felt as if I was free falling, and it took a lot of time and processing and support to be able to restore lightness to my life, because my despair, my anguish was deep, deep down to my toes. And I hear you, I think, grappling with, that crystallized moment. I think that I had a series of moments where I was reckoning with how I was going to survive this.
Mm-hmm.
And continue to, because I think there's something, losing a child is inherently traumatic no matter how they pass. When we look at your loss or mine, there are different other features of the trauma. But these things happen suddenly, unexpectedly, and before expectation and time. And then there's also this piece that you alluded to, which is the guilt, the feeling of failure, the feeling of regret, the feeling of deprivation and self-pity. I mean, there's so many elements to include the shock. So I think I got lucky in some ways because I, as a therapist and as someone who had a spiritual foundation, was able to do some things that would have been even harder for me to do had I not had those ingredients already in my life, where I began to actually feel closer to a higher power instead of feeling abandoned by a higher power. I also began to give myself self-compassion, and I knew I needed to, even though that's definitely not my typical go-to. I'm very characteristically quite hard on myself, and I push myself to, and I think I'm noticing it, now that my book is out and I'm slowing down with promoting it as much. I'm wondering if I'm a good enough mother, if I've done enough to demonstrate my love and loyalty to my son. I'm always driven by those kinds of questions. This good enough mother piece comes into play. And so to be able to consciously try to forgive myself for any decisions I might have made, or anything I might have said, or anything I might have done that I might do differently, was part of, and luckily I was able to work on that through the process of writing the book. So that was such a benefit, an unexpected gift.
That's really interesting, taking an action, because I found through the process of the time my daughter was in that relationship and after her loss, and trying to get through the court systems and process, a lot of times I feel, and the rest of my family feels, that we have no power. We're powerless in all of it. So writing about it and holding conferences and creating foundation in my daughter's name, all that is ways that I'm
Yes.
maybe regaining some of that power. So
Yes.
what I want to go to now is this whole idea of grief. So, and I always separated the grief, the one you live in, versus the one you can assess intellectually. The one that's through the eyes of a mother, and one that's through the eyes of either professional or the way you process information. Because if you would have asked me what that should look like for a mother before my daughter was taken, I would have had a different way of looking at it versus way I would look at it now. So what I want to ask you is, you have both sides. You have the mother side, and you also have the therapist side, the professional side. So you write not just from a personal experience, but from your work as a therapist. So I want you to explore with us, how did these two parts of you interact or conflict with each other when you are navigating your own personal grief?
Yes, I do. I agree with you. There are these two sides, and professionally, it's one thing to have an understanding, and I do think it's helpful to have one. I mean, I recognize that none of us want to feel that exceptional powerlessness that results from loss, and that we do various things when we feel powerless. We try to control things that are usually beyond our control. And then we blame ourselves and guilt ourselves, and further compound our grief with all of the torturous ways that we can stay in guilt, or ask ourselves whether we're doing it properly. And I've been susceptible to all of those, even though I know what they look like. Grief is so messy. Grief over the loss of a child from the inside is, people talk about its ebbs and its flows. I mean, I was saturated with despair for years. And I write in Reaching for Beautiful about the fact that it took me personally, 7 years to feel like myself again. And as a therapist, I think about you and what you're enduring now in terms of this prolonged trauma. And I know that it's probably far from possible to even restore a sense of groundedness while you're waiting to see what happens with this trial of the man who murdered your daughter. And I know that I have been blessed in some ways, and then I know in other ways I have a history of some trauma that also compounds the way I experienced losing my son. And so there's so many different complex, unique pieces to this that we can't possibly know what anyone else is really doing with it or up against. But and one day it might look like it's going well, and then the next day, I could be brought to my knees. There's not a lot of predicting. There are anticipatable triggers for bursts of grief, but there are also all of the unanticipated ones, like I think you referred to. Sometimes social media can be such a source of connection, and other times it can further alienate us. Grief is a lonely road.
So, what surprised you most about your own grieving process, even with all the clinical knowledge, clinical practice background you have? What was it that you didn't expect that surprised you the most?
There have been gifts in it, Fartumo, and I wouldn't have thought, even despite hearing that it is in great darkness where we find the light.
Mm-hmm.
I feel so grateful that I got to be Christopher's mother, and I feel as if there have been these lessons about life and the meaning of life that have crystallized for me. I do know that Christopher wants me to be leading a happy, fulfilled, joyful life. I think someone told me recently, it was someone who read my newsletter recently, and she said, I feel as if Christopher's trying to tell you not to take it all so seriously. And, and I thought, I'm sure he is. And there are times that my loyalty to him would have me thinking that I shouldn't give myself permission to have joy. But I do believe we are meant to find that. And for me, I have to really consciously look for it. And that's what Reaching for Beautiful is about. It's about choosing to look at the love that I continue to have in my heart for my firstborn, and to show everyone that I do love in my world, show them that they are loved, and demonstrate that, and continue to keep my heart open just at a time when it would be really easy to close it and protect myself from ever getting hurt. And we're not meant to be spared from hurt, and we're not meant to spare our children from it. This is what the substance of being here is all about.
Thank you. I found the greatest challenge for me within this loss and within this grieving landscape was the idea of forgiveness, especially toward myself. And as we spoke before, the feeling of this overwhelming guilt and the fact that having control of your life, of my life at least, became elusive. I couldn't really grab it and pin it down so I can gain some control over it. Not the time she lived in this abusive relationship, and even now going through the justice system. and all these questions that pile on my mind. And there is a part of the memoir where you speak about the illusion of keeping Christopher safe. That hit me so deeply as a mother, to see, the illusion of me trying to keep my daughter not only safe, but to convince her to get out of that relation, because she left 11 times, and the first 10 times she always found her way back in. So that really resonated with me. And so I want you to share with us what helped you begin to forgive yourself, or to start the process of forgiving yourself, even if you haven't reached full forgiveness at this point.
Yes, again, because of my participation in 12-step programs, there was an emphasis on being really accountable for my mistakes. And I've always had that orientation anyway. But I really love that and this spiritual course that Christopher led me to, the emphasis on self-forgiveness, and beginning to permit myself to be more loving and compassionate with myself than I'd ever been before, as treating myself in a way that I would treat essentially anyone else.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered that I could also use writing as a means to release guilt. So I could write into all of my regret. I could write into all of the ways that I felt sorry that I'd been imperfect as a mother, that I'd been fear-filled, that I'd been desperate, that I'd been chasing a connection with my son and losing sight of the connection that was already there, that none of it was ever in my control anyway. And I stood at his graveside and I read my amends to him, and it really helped. It helped a great deal to reconcile all of this. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not to say that it doesn't come back over me, because all of this, it feels like there are waves of all of it, whether it's waves of guilt and self-forgiveness, or waves of self-pity and gratitude, or waves of pain and waves of joy. There are all of these different simultaneous extreme feelings in this. And it can
Yeah.
be very complex, but we must love ourselves through this.
What would you say to a parent or parents listening now to this episode who are still stuck in the cycle of guilt, or all those questions that I experienced, and I'm sure you did too, of what ifs? What if this happened? What would you say to those parents?
I think guilt is one of the primary culprits of staying stuck in a grief that takes us way down into a tunnel that is barely survivable. And if we are to survive, it is essential that we relinquish control, and that we do that by appreciating that blaming ourselves doesn't give us power. The only power that we really have in moving through this, and I like to think I'm moving through it in a way that I'm making my son proud, is to get closer and closer to acceptance with what is. And that means, and that's the tough part, because I'm going to say the thing that none of us want to hear,
Mm-hmm.
which is being willing to touch into the feelings of powerlessness and despair and let it have its way with us enough so that we can come back up for air again. Because if we don't kind of permit that feeling to lighten, then some of the beauty in the world is out of reach.
That's really interesting. So here is the idea. When a year passed and I was still, like you said, one day I feel or it feels like I am okay, and another day I feel like ground beneath my feet shifted. So I asked myself, how long will this grief take? Then I realized that if I loved my child, then I would have continued to love them if she wasn't gone. Then I can't expect the grief to lead. I call the grief to be love remembered. And in your book, you write about how love
Absolutely.
doesn't end. Love doesn't end with losing your child, but it evolves into something different. So, what does your love for Christopher look like now that he's been gone for a while?
It's it's um, it's interesting because it's like a number of things that have crystallized where that love, it's it's got a deeper essence to it, and it's it's where I choose to focus. This idea of all that we love deeply becomes a part of us, which Helen Keller wrote. It feels like it's deepened my understanding of why I'm here. It informs me and gives me purpose in my work. If I am leading with an open heart, one that risks getting hurt, if I am being authentic and true and vulnerable and attempting to serve others, then I think that's all I'm supposed to be up to. And I feel like my son's spirit encourages me to live that way. And so that's where things have gelled.
Thank you so much. That's a beautiful answer. So, how has grief taught you about the power of love, especially a love that doesn't get to be expressed in the physical presence? That's what we want. We want to be able to text or call or hug or see them for holidays. So what did you learn about love that doesn't have that physical component but still exists within you?
It's so interesting, and I don't know if I can articulate this, but I've been thinking about it lately, that I'm a person, I think largely because I didn't feel my father's love as a child, who has insisted of myself that I show the people that I love them in such a way that they know it, that it's deeply felt, because my father could use the words, but I didn't feel like he had the capacity to really help me feel his love. And so it is tricky, especially as a mother who typically would show her love by doing things for her children. I'm very touchy and demonstrative that way, and or I'm curious and inquisitive about how they are. Well, none of those things tend to land very heavily on any of my children, and nor did they necessarily on Christopher before he went to heaven. But I think for me, there's a lesson in just resting into what is known and accepted, that I don't have to prove or earn or show anything. It's known. It's just simply known. And no, do I get to hug him relentlessly, or call or text him, or lay my eyes on his beautiful self? I don't. But I do speak to him in my heart and soul with every ounce of my being, for most of my days, and will continue to for the rest of my days.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you so much for this interview. Thank you for this story. Thank you for this truth and this courage. I know so many of our listeners will hear their own story or a loved one's story in your words. But before we close, I would love to ask you, what does the title Reaching for Beautiful mean to you? And what do you hope this book gives to others, especially parents, survivors, or those who are still in the midst of the loss?
It's been a privilege to be with you, and I really appreciate your deeper questions causing me to reflect. And I hope that people who are listening feel less alone in their own grieving. And I hope that this idea of reaching for beautiful can help each of us to continue to stay and live our best lives. What it means, I think, is to just continue to make that conscious choice. Christopher he tweeted about a month before he passed, a mantra that I wear on my wrists, and which is what Reaching for Beautiful was sort of derived from, and it's life is honestly so beautiful as long as you allow it to be. So where do we focus our energy and our attention? What choices we make to find all of the love and all of the goodness and all of the beauty that's here.
So how do you reach for beautiful?
Well, I actually literally reach out for my son every day, every
Okay.
morning. I pray to him. And as you described, I continue to honor him and celebrate him every day. And I carry out what I believe to be my purpose. And I really am looking for the good, looking for a way to direct my attention and energy towards that which is love rather than fear, light rather than darkness. Doesn't mean I don't go there. It doesn't mean I pretend those things don't exist, because I actually have to move through them. But if I do that work, then I have greater access to feeling my son's presence in a different way, and to the motivation to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was beautiful, and what you shared with us. Sally's book is a gift. And in my opinion, after reading it, I can truly say that it's a gift, one that sits with you in the quiet, in the ache, in the light that follows heartbreak. You can find Reaching for Beautiful wherever books are sold, and there will be a link for where you can order the book in the show description. To those of you listening, if you're grieving, if you're loving someone who's struggling and you don't know how to reach them, if you're just trying to hold on to hope in a hard season, this episode is for you. We'll be back next week with more stories that refuse to be silenced. Until then, grieve in your own way, love in your own way, and remember, you are not alone. See you next week.